Ever feel like staring at this massive task? Like something so big, it just seems impossible.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're looking at in today's deep dive.
Okay.
Going back to ancient Jerusalem, unpacking Cornerstone Connections Lesson 3.
Right.
It's the story of rebuilding the temple.
It's amazing how a story from like thousands of years ago, still kind of hits home today. And it's not just talking about bricks and mortar and actually building something. It's about rebuilding lives and faith and a connection to something bigger.
We've got excerpts from the lesson itself, insights from Ellen White's Prophets and Kings, even a timeline we're going to be using to guide us. So are you ready to roll up our sleeves?
Absolutely. Let's unearth some wisdom.
This lesson just paints this really vivid picture of what it was like for the Jewish exiles returning to Jerusalem after the exile. Imagine that mix of emotions. Relief to be home, but then faced with this, just utter destruction.
It's that exhale but then gulp moment. Right. Where you think you're getting the keys to your dream house and you open the door and it's completely been, ravaged by raccoons doing Zumba. Except in this case, it's the heart of their faith, the symbol of God's presence.
Where do you even begin to rebuild that?
That is a question that I think even today a lot of us ask. Where do we begin when we're facing something that just seems so insurmountable? This lesson reminds us that sometimes the first step is really just acknowledging the hand of God even when it feels like chaos.
No pressure, right? Just rebuild the most sacred place in your history, a place that represents this covenant with God. But they did have one thing going for them. Something that I think every time I read it, it just blows my mind.
What's that?
King Cyrus of Persia.
Ezra 6. The Persian king, inspired by God, not only allows the temple to be rebuilt, but actually orders it, provides resources.
It's like finding out that the person who totaled your car in that fender bender is now personally financing your dream vacation as an apology.
Right. Speaks volumes about how God can work through anyone, even those we might least expect.
Right.
Here you have a pagan king playing like this pivotal role in restoring God's presence. It's a reminder that God's plans, they're bigger than our limited understanding.
I just imagine the whispers between the returning exiles. Wait, Cyrus, the guy with 14 different provinces, a penchant for chariots made of gold, he's on board with this.
And that's just it. Those unexpected moments of grace, those are turning points.
For sure.
But even with that support, the task ahead was immense. Discouragement, doubt, those are human emotions, and they were undoubtedly present.
Which is where the prophet Zechariah enters the scene and talk about a name that inspires hope. Yahweh remembers, and that's a message that resonates, right? God remembers us even when we feel forgotten, overwhelmed, just lost in all the rubble of our own lives.
He becomes this voice of encouragement, reminding everyone that this isn't about their own human strength. It's about tapping into God's power. And one of the most striking images he uses is in Zechariah 2, a vision of Jerusalem bustling with life. Families are thriving, but there are no walls.
Okay, now that's interesting. A city with no walls? That seems a little risky, don't you think? I mean, I triple check that my front door is locked every night.
And that's precisely the point. True security, the kind that matters most, that comes from God, not physical barriers. He's saying, I am your protector, your defender. When you put your trust in God, even the impossible becomes possible.
It's that if God is for us, who can be against us kind of thinking. It's such a powerful reminder that sometimes the walls that we build around ourselves, those walls of fear, doubt, insecurity, they can actually prevent us from experiencing the fullness of God's protection, provision.
And alongside this message of encouragement, we also see this practical side of rebuilding coming into focus through Ezra.
All right, let's talk about Ezra. He's like the ultimate record keeper, right? If this were today, he'd be the one with the color-coded spreadsheets, label maker. Everything has to look official.
Precisely. Ezra was meticulous. And his attention to detail captured in Ezra 6, it actually played this really crucial role.
Okay, spill it. How do spreadsheets and label makers save the day? I need to know.
Well, you remember those enemies we talked about earlier? Opposed to the rebuilding. A well-placed spreadsheet can be surprisingly effective.
What do you mean?
Those records that Ezra kept. They became vital when opposition flared up again.
So it's like, objection, hearsay. And Ezra's like, actually, it's right here. Line 42, subsection B, initialed by King Cyrus himself.
You got it. Those records demonstrated that the rebuilding had royal approval.
Even from a previous administration.
They couldn't really argue with the paperwork, especially when it was backed by a king.
That's impressive. It's like God can work through anything and everything. Miracles, prophecies, and good old-fashioned organization.
We often try to separate the spiritual and the practical, but this story shows them working hand in hand.
Yeah.
And, those records weren't just about, silencing critics. They also tell a story. When you look at all the details that Ezra recorded, you get this sense of ordinary people just doing extraordinary things.
Day after day.
Brick by brick.
Yeah, it's like that quote, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." Except in this case, it's a temple. I'm guessing there were way more than 1,000 steps involved. But speaking of those steps, it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it?
No, not at all.
The lesson mentions some serious pushback from people who were not thrilled about this temple being rebuilt.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that progress rarely comes without opposition. Ezra 4 describes how their enemies used intimidation, spread rumors. They even tried to infiltrate the work to sabotage it.
Oh, so it's getting real. I bet there were some strongly worded petitions going around the Chariot parking lot. Was there a spokesperson? Did anyone chain themselves to a pile of rubble in protest?
Clear's throat. This wasn't just a difference of opinion.
Right.
Their opposition had real consequences.
Really?
The work on the temple actually stopped for a time. Can you imagine putting your heart and soul into something only to be met with that kind of resistance?
It's enough to make you want to throw your hands up in the air and just say, fine, keep your ruined temple. We're opening a hummus stand. Business is going to be booming.
But they didn't give up. And that's another testament to God's faithfulness.
Okay.
This lesson reminds us that delays don't equal denial. He often allows trials to refine our faith, deepen our dependence on Him.
It's like when you're baking bread and you think the kneading will never end.
Right.
But then you realize that process of pushing and pulling, that's what gives the bread its texture.
Its strength.
Sometimes the delays in our lives are actually the kneading that we need.
I like that.
So how did they finally push through that opposition? Did King Cyrus send a strongly worded memo?
More divine intervention. This time in the form of not one, but two prophets. Haggai and Zechariah back for a spiritual pep talk. Round 2.
A prophetic tag team. I'm picturing them now with those inspirational posters you see in weight rooms.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like pain is weakness, leaving the body, but with a more "thus saith the Lord" vibe.
And just as effective, Haggai's message in chapter 1, verse 4 is a pointed question. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin?
Ooh, he went there. It's like when you've been putting off a major project and then your friend, they gently point out that you've had plenty of time for Netflix but haven't touched a single spreadsheet.
He's calling out their priorities,
Right.
urging them to think about what really matters.
Okay.
And then Zechariah. He reminds them of the power behind the promise.
Okay.
Remember that image from Zechariah 4? What are you, O mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you will become level ground.
Obstacles crumbling like stale cookies.
Yes.
It's like a reminder that with God, those impossible situations, they don't stand a chance.
And the best part? They didn't just overcome the external opposition. They also had to confront their own internal struggles.
Like what?
Doubt, apathy, the temptation to just settle for good enough. This part of the story is so relatable.
It's like we all have a little bit of ancient Jerusalem rubble in our own lives, you
Yeah.
know? Those places where we've just let things fall apart, where we've lost our momentum, and maybe we've settled for just good enough when deep down we know we can do more.
It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, lose sight of that bigger picture. This story reminds us that rebuilding, whether it's a temple or a life, it requires us to really confront those obstacles head on.
And it's in those moments when we actually choose faith over fear, action over apathy,
Yeah.
that we really see God's power at work.
Absolutely.
It's like the Israelites just rolling up their sleeves and they're picking up the bricks and they're saying, okay, God, we're ready. We're ready to partner with you in this.
And partner, they did.
Yeah.
They pushed through those challenges, internal, external, and eventually the day came. The Cornerstone temple was finished, a testament to God's faithfulness
Wow.
and the resilience of the human spirit.
I can only imagine just that sense of awe, maybe even a little disbelief as they dedicated that temple. But here's the thing that gets me. This isn't just about a building, is it?
Not at all. This lesson connects the dots between the physical temple and what represented spiritually.
Yeah.
Think about it. The temple was designed to be a place where God dwelled among his people, a place of worship, of sacrifice, and ultimately reconciliation.
It's like rebuilding a physical representation of their covenant with God, brick by brick, prayer by prayer.
And this is where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
This temple, it was a foreshadowing. a glimpse of something even greater.
I love where this is going. Hit me with the prophetic foreshadowing.
The temple, in all his grandeur, ultimately points to Jesus Christ.
Okay.
He is the true temple, the ultimate dwelling place of God. Remember how Zechariah talked about Jerusalem, a city without walls, because God himself was its protector?
Yes. And then Jesus in the New Testament says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. John 2:1.
He wasn't talking about a literal building.
Right.
He was talking about his own body, about a new covenant, a new way to connect with God.
It was like taking this grand, awe-inspiring temple and making it portable, accessible to everyone. But just like that physical temple had a foundation, this lesson reminds us that our lives, our faith, it needs a firm foundation too.
And that foundation is Jesus Christ.
He is the rock.
He's the rock on which we build our lives.
Yeah. Makes me think about the things I'm building my life on, the priorities, beliefs, habits. Am I building on something solid, something that can really weather those storms?
And one thing that stood out to me in Prophets and Kings was Ellen White's reminder that human power and might did not establish the Church of God, and neither can they destroy it.
It's so easy to get caught up in the how. How are we going to do this? How are we going to get over this obstacle? But ultimately, it's not about our strength. It's not about our cleverness. It's not about our resources. It's about surrendering to something so much bigger than us.
It's about trusting in God's power, his plan,
Right.
even when we can't see the full picture.
Yeah.
It's remembering we're a part of this story that's far beyond us, a story that began before us and will continue long after us.
So as we wrap up this incredible deep dive, I hope you're listening and you take this with you. You are a builder.
That's right.
Every day, you are building something with your choices, your actions, just how you respond to the world around you. What are you building on? Is it a foundation that will stand, a foundation that reflects the truth of God's love, his faithfulness? Keep seeking that solid ground. Keep building. And keep trusting in the one who holds it all together,